The realignment, I'm sure most of you know, was a major reorganization of IDB, decided in 2006, implemented in 2007. About 300 staff left the bank. All of the managerial cadre pretty much was replaced. It cost, I think, $61 million in direct funding, and then there were other costs along the way. So it was a big effort that IDB put in place to try to make IDB more relevant and a greater presence in the LAC region. Pablo will go into that in more detail, but I think it was a major event. The documents themselves called for an evaluation. We are doing it this year rather than last year. We did it in 2013 rather than 2012 because we had the very big IDB 9 evaluation in 2012. But this gives us plenty of time to look at the 5 years of implementation to now. I do want to say, keep in mind, it's really hard to reform a big organization, and it's hard to turn a super tanker. And in a sense, anytime you're working with the multilateral development bank of this size, it takes time. And we see this very much as an effort to add value. I think matrix organizations are constantly needing to be checked and adjusted as they go along. And so we see this as an effort to help management and the board find ways to continue to improve how IDB functions. So we really want to be constructive, and I just wanted to put everything in that context. So the way we'll handle today, Pablo Alonso, who's the team leader, and we had quite a good, large team, and many people are here that could answer specifics, but Pablo was the team leader. And many of you know Pablo. He's been around for a long time, knows the bank very well. I think was an ideal person to lead this evaluation. He'll present the findings in 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'll come back and summarize the recommendations that we made, and then we'll have questions and answers. As I said, you can submit questions from a field office, and otherwise, so that everybody can hear, including the video streaming, please come to the microphone with your questions. So with no further ado, I'll turn over to Pablo.
First of all, thank you very much to all of you for being here and for participating in this evaluation, without which the findings would have been impossible. We wouldn't have been able to find anything. I remind you that if anyone's standing, there are some seats up front if you wish to sit. There are several seats empty up front. The first question is, what is the realignment? And the truth is that it's important for us to answer this question because we have found so many ideas as people interviewed. What OVE did mainly was to make sure we were evaluating the documents presented by management within the concept of the realignment, and that we were actually evaluating that and not our opinions or the opinions of others of what the realignment was or should have been. The realignment meant changes in the structure of the matrix of the bank, definitions, responsibilities, authorities, processes, human resources, incentives to reach a series of strategic goals. All these structural, procedural, and human resource and incentive changes were to achieve 4 intermediate objectives. One of them, greater country focus. The second, greater sector focus. The third, greater results-based management. And the fourth, greater institutional efficiency. Presumably, in keeping with the documents presented by the realignment, if these 4 objectives were achieved, the bank would have a greater impact on the development, and as a result, its presence and relevance in the region would increase. Remember that the realignment takes place in 2005-2006. It's approved in 2006, precisely when many of the countries were repaying their debt to the bank, and the bank was beginning to have a lower index of approval with much more competition, not only with other multilaterals, but with private sector financial entities, which, thanks to the fact that the countries had greater access, were competing quite strongly with the bank. So all this begins, but I have to repeat that what we do in the evaluation is to measure exactly what the bank said they were going to do. And the bank said they were going to improve these 4 goals: greater country focus, greater sector focus, greater efficiency, and greater results-based management. And in the evaluation, we're not focusing on the results-based management because that was evaluated last year with the IDB 9 evaluation. So what we're doing with our evaluation is to see to what extent the bank has actually achieved those goals or objectives. And the content of each one of these, country focus, sector focus, and institutional efficiency, is defined in the realignment documents. How have we been able to evaluate this, which is so difficult to understand, really, because, well, we've gone underground, let's say, and looked everywhere where it's difficult to find the data to be able to really find them. First, we've done a quantity and qualitative evaluation, and we've obtained data from both sources, and they're both quite strong. We've looked around everywhere in the bank's management data, budgetary data, staff data, and have also obtained the opinions of more than 500 people and in different ways. And one could say that we actually have a sound evaluation framework. We did it before and after. The realignment, or something like a realignment, cannot be subjected to causal inference methods. We cannot evaluate do the quasi or experimental analysis. We did a non-experimental before and after evaluation, but if done with sufficient care, we can have a first approximation of the actual impact of something like the realignment. Before and after, for example, we were comparing the management data of 2004, 2005, 2006 with the management data of years later, and we tried to do it as late as possible, like 2010, 2012, so that we could avoid the usual noise of the first years of a realignment when things are not actually working perfectly. We focused mainly on interviewing people who, by April of last year, had been at least 8 years in the bank. And we did a survey of 257 officers who complied with this, and it was a survey designed not only to get opinion, but to get information from them of data, actual data. The survey was analyzed to see its reliability in content as well as in easy reading, to actually give us the ease that we were not confusing things. Then we did more than 90 structured interviews with bank staff following the same characteristics, and officers, country representatives, who had also worked in the bank for at least 8 years. And in some cases that was impossible, so we asked for the opinion of people who were country representatives as well as bank representatives who might not have had the 8 years, but who had a lot of experience. And with all the information, we did an information triangulation to ensure that it was consistent. And at the end, we believe we have conclusions based on very strong evidence, because we found a lot of things, but we focused only on those that showed that the evidence found was really significant and overwhelming, almost unanimous in all those interviewed and surveyed. So we really didn't expect, you always ask yourself, were there any surprises? And the truth is that we've asked the question and the people said no, there were no surprises, because what we're saying here is what you have told us, on the one hand, and which has been corroborated by quantitative information as well. Now, let's talk about the findings. The bank, we've noticed, has advanced. It has advanced considerably in the original direction of sector focus and technical skill. We also believe that the idea of strengthening the decentralization was the right decision. That when there are objectives that could seem contradictory initially, as though a greater sector focus on the one hand and another greater country focus to place more loans but doing it with technical criteria, could often lead to conflicts in some cases. And in organizations like these that are pursuing 2 or 3 objectives that may be contradictory, the matrix of the organization is the one that can initially lead to greater possibilities of success. But obviously for this to work, one has to have well-aligned incentives. Now, as for the specific objectives of the sector focus, first, what do the reorganization documents do or say of what the sector focus was? Well, first, what they expected was to update the staff's technical skills. Secondly, eliminate the different types of fragmentations that had been identified. For example, the separation there was between design and execution, the separation there was between headquarters and country offices, the separations there were between the different regional organizations we had. We had 3 regions, and it was said that a person who works in Region 1, for example, could not offer its expertise to other regions of the bank. And so we had to break these cycles. The third objective was to make the bank focus more concretely on certain sector areas. The idea that he who tries to do too much does very little, which was what was behind this objective. In other words, instead of having the bank do everything, it should focus more on, say, 4, 5, 6 areas, and focus the strategic focus and its staff and the skills of the staff to give it greater weight. And lastly, improve the generation as well as allocation of knowledge. So what have we found? We found, and this is something you have told us, and that's how we've seen it as well with some of the quantitative indicators, an improvement in the technical skills of the staff. We have more masters, more PhDs amongst our staff than before, but we're also being perceived by our counterparts as more technical staff with greater knowledge of the technical subjects that we had before the realignment. Without a doubt, the dichotomy there was between design and execution has been broken. Before the realignment, if I recall correctly, there was only about the average number of hours of the people working in the country offices that did the design phase was maybe 60, 62 hours, and now we have about 150 something, according to the data of last April. So there's been almost a doubling of the number of hours in the country office staff dedicating to the design. The number of bank staffs working in the country offices who are also project leaders has also fourfolded. So there are a number of indicators that actually show that there's been a considerable improvement in this fragmentation between the design and execution. And one can expect that this would have an important impact not only in the design and operations, but in the future maybe in the executability and impact. Furthermore, we've noticed greater collaboration between headquarters and country offices, but within the sectors themselves, we haven't actually found, let's say, greater collaboration between headquarters and the country offices amongst the different sectors. But we do see this with the people who work in FMM in country office and headquarters or any other division. There has been greater collaboration between them, as well as a significant increase in the bank's capacity to both generate and disseminate knowledge. all of you have actually told us, and the country representatives, and when we study the quantitative data of the academic production of the bank staff, we've also seen a considerable increase. And don't think that it's only been the RES staff, it's the operations staff that has most increased this academic production. So what are the challenges? Well, if we had 3 silos in the past, now we have 16. We had 3 silos, which were the 3 regions. Now we have 13 sector divisions and 2 XM windows, of the private sector. And all of you have told us that there's really no collaboration, that the countries complain saying that what they have are problems, not sectors, that what they want to do is tackle poverty, they want to tackle productivity or growth. But if you give me a health program and an education program and a state reform program, and they don't talk amongst them. So when you prepare a strategy, and we'll see that a little later, maybe people from the same division send 3 technical notes that are not in coordination with each other, and maybe even up to 17 technical notes that we have to prepare, but they're not coordinated, they're not integrated to develop a single strategy. So the truth is that this has been overwhelming. The response we've heard, that there is no intersectoral cooperation. Though the second finding is that though there's been an increase in the technical skill of the staff member himself and his technical knowledge, there's not been, or in fact there's been a deterioration in that same staff member in executing a project on average. Younger people have been hired, people with greater technical knowledge, but people who actually had no experience in execution and knew nothing about how to execute procurement projects and things like that. And we've heard this from the counterparts as well. And we also made a comparison of the curricula before and after, which supports this data as well. There's been no change in the strategic orientation of the bank. We are with the exact same number and proportion of sectors before the realignment. There's been no change in the program. So there's really, it wouldn't seem as though the bank has actually focused more on those 5 areas they identified in the realignment documents where presumably the bank would be placing greater emphasis on. And as for the meritocracy processes of managers hiring, in the realignment documents, we're not following what's said in the realignment documents. On the one hand, the perception of the transparency in managerial appointment has deteriorated. And I'll explain. In the realignment document, it was said verbatim that the systems applied, or the bank's policy, which was implemented in 1995, could not be captured completely, and therefore it was suggested in the realignment document that the bank, in all managerial appointments, should establish clear contractual criteria and clear processes. Yes, they're doing more than they're doing before. Now, 43 of the managerial posts, are through competitive methods, and those of us before knew that that was more the exception than the rule.
Over 80% of division heads have been hired by competitive processes. However, we are only at 44% rather than 100%, which is what the realignment document specified. So, definitively, we have seen an increase in what we might call the sectorial focus, but the matrix is not yet working adequately to generate all of the expected benefits. I'd like to give you an example of the kind of analysis that we performed to prove one of these important points of how the matrix functions. We carried out a social networks analysis to determine the points of connection. You might not be able to see it very well here, but each color is basically a different sector. You will here see that the colors are isolated from each other. This is prior to realignment. That is, there were connections, but within sectors. Each of these colors is a different sector. That's 2006. What do we have in 2012? We see there are larger groups, but the colors continue to be isolated. That is, the regional isolation has been broken. We had 3, 5 here, 8 there, but now we have those 16 people together, but all of them in the same sector. Do you understand? So, and all of the statistics from the social network analysis establish that these are significant, or rather that there are no differences, that statistically these differences are not significant. There has been no change in terms of the level of inter-sectorial collaboration in the bank. As far as the second of these goals, we have the country focus. What do the realignment documents specify in terms of country focus? The slogan was to turn the country offices into a single facility for delivery of all bank products, and would translate basically in a greater capability for the country offices to carry out the political and program strategy talks, as well as increasing the bank's ability within countries to design and execute products. What has been achieved? There has been a greater delegation of responsibility to design strategy to the field. Prior to realignment, strategies were designed at headquarters. It was the country headquarter chiefs who were responsible for this. Today, this responsibility has been transferred to the country offices. Before, these officers were at the headquarters. Now, the officers are at the country offices. So there has been a transfer of this responsibility to the countries. There has also been improvement in the design process, not merely the improvement of the document itself, but we at OVE felt, and all of you also told us, that there has been a significant improvement in the quality of operations design, the SPD's role, the distribution, everything all of us have gone through to learn the new mechanisms have been yielding results. We have better projects today. The projects are better designed, rather. We shall see in the future if these projects are indeed having greater effectiveness in development. But we might add that many have told us that we are the envy of many multilateral organizations, because many of our products, at least in the beginning, are far superior than some of our competitors. There has been another very important aspect which has generated a very positive dynamic in terms of project feedback, which is the delegation to various team members, team leader, the trustees or fiduciary officers, the team advocate, who have given authority for various hiring decisions and expenses, which has generated a very positive dynamics in terms of execution. What challenges remain? We have elephantiasis at the headquarters. The decisions are still made mostly at headquarters. There has been significant transfer of responsibility, but not of authority. Decisions are still made at headquarters. There is no clarity as to the distinctions between representative responsibilities and manager responsibilities. It depends more on the personality of the people involved than of a clear regulatory system that assigns what each person needs to do. And particularly what country representatives tell us is that they see much confusion, and they still seem to have to wait for decisions to be made at headquarters in order for these decisions to be carried out. There is also, as we said before, a reduced implementation capacity. This, which we saw at the sector focus where the technical skills of individuals have increased, but not so much their executive capacity has increased. And we are told this by our counterparts, where the multidisciplinary specialists we might have before didn't know so much about the specific subjects, but an engineer would not know so much about state resources, but they knew how to execute projects. We may have somebody now who knows a lot about education but has never run a project. This has led to problems. We're seeking for the country delegations to be more flexible to meet these challenges, but this also depends on the efforts of individual personalities. And then another thing we have heard over and over again is how frustrated everyone is in operations with the approval and quality improvement process. They say, basically, that the QRR is an irrelevant aspect where people barely attend. This is a very sketch, an approximation, but this is not the worst. The worst is that it is a process that never comes to closure. We get there, but there are a number of previous and simultaneous and posterior parallel processes, and even after the document reaches OPC, it continues to change, which generates great uncertainty, stress, and additional work. So, what is the bottom line? There was an increase in the country focus, but the incentives are not yet properly aligned for design and execution. And it's very important that we speak about incentives, and that is, for instance, what has to do with pressures for approval and disbursement that were very strong prior to realignment. In the interviews, structured interviews and interviews, we have heard the same thing. And in the structured and unstructured interviews, we have also interviewed the government officers. It is true that the bank now places greater emphasis on development effectiveness than before. That was almost absent before, but when push comes to shove and we need to approve, disperse, or decide on greater development effectiveness, the first come out ahead. They tell us that the pressure to approve and disperse are even greater now than before realignment. So even though the shortfalls of the bank have improved to design projects towards development as an expression of pressure to approve and disperse, this positive pressure is not only canceled but reversed by these additional pressures. I would like to show you some of the results of the case studies that we did in 10 countries. We held external and internal, structured and unstructured interviews. These reflect only a few of the conclusions we reached, but just to show you. I'm not sure if you can you see this? The sector knowledge of specialists at the country offices. For the most part, most of the bank officers as well as the country representatives say that they have obviously found a significant and valuable increase. Let's go, for instance, to collaboration. Collaboration within the division. They say, yes, they have seen collaboration, but then let's see their answers in terms of intra-sectorial coordination. 100% of case studies of the focus groups, both internally and externally, complained that there was not intersectorial collaboration in the bank. Not only that there was no collaboration, but that it had even deteriorated as far as roles. Nearly 90%, both external and internal groups, say that there is great confusion amongst the roles of representatives and country managers. In terms of the authority of representatives to carry the program out, basically 100% of bank officers and 70% of country representatives say there are problems. And we need to recall the comments of some country representatives speaking of the frustration they face with a portfolio that is not being executed and that they have no power to push it forward. This frustration in some cases got to the extent of them saying, we can't do anything, we don't have the power, it's at the headquarters, at the various country divisions, and it's like trying to herd cats. It's very difficult to achieve anything, to move anything forward in terms of portfolio execution when we have all of these difficult bureaucratic difficulties and incentives. Obviously, there are variations in very large representations, 450 people, 150 products, 150 operations. It's very difficult that a small country office may have 5, 6, or up to 15 projects, and when you have 8 or 10 officers available, it's easier to carry out. But the results are definitely as stated. So as to not bore you, we will move a little further ahead. An important point is preferred treatment that the bank gives headquarter officers to country office representatives. The officers hired from the headquarters relative to officers hired at the representation, even though they later come back to headquarters, the statistics show that there is about 1 degree of preference. If you are hired at headquarters, cedibus paribus, regardless of all other things being equal, education, experience, and so forth, you tend to enjoy 1 degree better than your peer at the country office. In terms of the final goal, which was to increase institutional efficiency, matrix organization, creating common offices, outsourcing, a number of things that were done to increase institutional efficiency, we have found some positive aspects. The bank is dispersing much faster. In the first few years, there was much greater disbursement than before. It used to be 10%. I think for the first year it was 27%. Now we're up to 37 for the second year, excuse me. So the disbursement processes are speeding up. Eligibility periods, that is from approval to declarement of eligibility, I think there has been a speeding up of 4 to 5 months. So this is becoming a lot faster. Response times, for instance, in terms of execution, international bidding, disbursement, and other types of responses that we did using the bank's Syscord system has also improved. What are the challenges? Well, first of all, the costs of realignments, aside from the 61.5 that they said it would cost, does not include other significant costs such as Optima, intangible costs such as the loss of institutional, the impact on pensions, which was very high, decentralization costs, which began at $2 million a year, and now we're at $4 million. But please, we also need to take into account that these costs may be necessary. Decentralization is good, and if it's expensive, it doesn't matter because perhaps that increases our impact and effectivity. Preparation times have not varied. There may be some dissonance between the numbers we reported on the one hand and the numbers given by management, because management has been saying all along that preparation times have been improving. What we have noticed is that there was not a homogeneous definition of what is the actual start time of a project. So what we did is we made a definition that was valid both before and after realignment. So that is the month. We count the project start time as when 40 a full week of work has been reported on the TRC. This is, if we use this definition, there has not, in fact, been any significant change in terms of reduction in time for preparation. Preparation times continue to be very much the same. Implementation costs have risen. We will see this in further detail. Undispersed balances continue to grow. And, well, now I will go into further detail with a few graphics to give you examples of what I'm talking about. But the basic point we're trying to make is that with the evidence at hand, we are not comfortable saying that the bank truly has improved its efficiency. Some indicators appear to show that it does, some others don't. Efficiency is a complex of many dimensions, and we cannot simplify this entire concept in a single dimension, such as, for instance, preparation cost divided by number of projects. We need to define what we understand by efficiency much more clearly, both at the strategic, institutional, and activity levels, have clear indicators to be able to truly draw useful inferences. I would like to make these points. For instance, total preparation cost divided by projects approved, we see was dropping before realignment. Since the year 2004, there was a steep drop. Then there's a brief climb. The costs increased towards 2007, and then they drop, obviously, due to the crisis. The denominator begins to grow. The crisis generates more projects. So if you increase the denominator, the ratio drops. But once that stabilizes after the crisis, we come to more or less the same levels. As far as response times in international purchases and disbursement, we see that all three have dropped significantly since 2007 in terms of total implementation cost divided by number of active projects. There's a drop from 2004 to 2008, but then they come back up. Perhaps a more robust indicator may be all of the bank expenses divided by million of disbursement or million of approvals. We see that before realignment they are dropping, but after the effects of the crisis, it comes back up and returns to similar levels as before the realignment. So this makes it very difficult for us to say that there has been a gain in efficiency. Now, I'm going to yield the floor to Cheryl so that she can speak to the recommendations that, on the basis of these observations, we have issued to the board.
Oh, I just wanted to summarize the recommendations that we made to management in response to all these findings that you have. We did find the summary that there has been progress, but the objectives still have not been fully met. We did not think the basic structure was bad. We said a matrix is almost inevitable in an organization like this, where you need the great sector depth. You also need the country focus and responsiveness. So you're going to have some kind of matrix structure, inevitably. So it wasn't a question of structure or reorganization or massive change. Our feeling was that things could be done within this current structure to achieve the objectives and to help achieve these objectives. So we had 5 recommendations for management. We divided it, I might say, in 2 levels. We had general recommendations that are almost general principles. And then we wanted to go a little deeper, as you'll see, with actually giving very specific options. OVE often gets criticized by being too general, so we would put the general ones out. But we want to give some specifics to really give it some meat. But they're options. The specific things are not absolutely formal recommendations, but they're options to consider. So the first recommendations, we have 5. The first one is really meant to really help decentralize authority significantly. And the basic recommendation, with which both management and the board agree, is to enhance country program focus, further strengthen the country management function in country office. That's a general principle that I think, as I said, the board I think, very much agrees with, and management also agrees. Now, the specifics, which we put on the table as a way to do that, again, to give it some bite, recommendations have to be something you can also disagree with. So we put some specifics. Should consider, among other options, decentralize the country management function by increasing the number of country managers to facilitate their deeper engagement in the country program, locating them in country offices, moving authority to the field, and maintaining country representatives only in countries without a manager to reduce managerial layers. So we're talking 8, 10, 12 country managers in the field with real full authority of decision making. Along with that, we're saying an option is to strengthen the ability of these country departments and country managers to allocate and monitor budgets to deliver operational inputs. So giving them more authority over the budget for that country and the delivery of the program in that country. Not just at the very beginning of the year, but throughout the year. So this is the first recommendation, which really means to meaningfully decentralize authority. The second recommendation, which really goes along with the first, these are not separable completely. They really are together a bit of a vision on how the bank could function somewhat differently in this matrix. The second one is oriented towards developing a true cross-network shared vision and really bringing the different silos together in much more of a shared vision. So the general principle is to enhance inter-VP coordination and country program coherence, strengthen the role of VPS and VPP in country strategy setting and programming. So that's the general recommendation. Again, both the board and management have agreed with that recommendation. Now, of course, the devil is in the details, and so we also gave some specific recommendations, which is to set up country teams. So it's not just the country manager, but it's a team responsible for the country program. And the team would have senior VPS and VPP specialists as well. So you would assign those, along with the regional economic advisors, to country strategy programming and implementation teams to ensure that they are together implementing and designing and implementing the country program and really bringing together the sector units in a common vision for the country. And where possible, situating all those people together, again, in country offices. We're not actually talking about a lot more people decentralizing to the field. A lot of the questions that came back was, this is too expensive, it costs too much to decentralize. So you can look at different options, but we're really not necessarily saying you need a lot more bodies to be decentralized, but you need more authority. So it's different types of people in field offices. So really, I think the second idea of a country team that together works on the vision, the analysis, the strategy, the program, and the implementation. Of course, the VPS people would be part of their VPS units, would report back to VPS, and would pull that broad VPS and VPP vision around a common vision for the country. So that's the second recommendation. The third, which is really designed to enhance quality control and make it more efficient and more effective. To strengthen development effectiveness, you strengthen the mechanisms for quality control of bank operational products. Again, that's a general principle. Both the board and management have agreed with this principle. It's hard to disagree, I guess, with that principle. But obviously, if you're going to have a very strong country presence that's very responsive to the country, you do need checks and balances in the system. You also need a good quality control function to be sure that we're always focusing also on development effectiveness. Now, our specific recommendation is to have managers of country departments chair the QRR process and really beef up the QRR process as a true one-stop quality control process that's taken very seriously. The reason we would suggest country departments VPC to do that is so that they engage in this process. They have to understand and they really own these products. A lot of these recommendations are getting, different units to own the products in a sense of the other units instead of just keeping the silos, but together they're working on these products. So that's to ensure meaningful review and ensure review with a country vision in mind and promote the QRR as truly a one-stop review mechanism that has real meaning. We also think SPD, we are suggesting to provide them with more and more operationally experienced staff, enlarging their responsibility to cover VPP as well as VPS. Of course, as you know, there are considerations going on of a merge-out scenario in the private sector, and we'll see how this relates to that. But we would think SPD should have a bank or even bank group-wide responsibility, and strengthening their capacity to oversee all bank sectors, which also means that SPD staff overseeing quality would not be part of project teams. They would actually be somewhat independent. I guarantee you SPD had nothing to do with this recommendation, although they do agree with it, I believe. But we really feel it's important to have a strong quality control when you also have strong, delegated authority in country offices. The fourth recommendation is really about efficiency and increasing real incentives for efficient use of resources. The general recommendation to enhance efficiency, continue to strengthen budget processes and information systems to ensure full and accurate cost accounting. Again, both the board and management agree with that general principle. We are suggesting specifically that bank should consider having division chiefs allocate fixed annual budgets to team leaders that cover all costs, staff costs, consultants, travel, etc., for project design and for implementation, with some flexibility to allocate over the year as needed. But basically, we're talking about task budgets that task managers have, and they have from the beginning, and they know how much they need to spend to deliver a task. And they have to count staff time in that as well as variable costs. Of course, if they need more, they can go back to their manager and say, really, I need more, and they'll have to work with it. But the idea of a real disciplined task budget, which we don't feel exists from all that we hear yet in IDB, would really bring some kind of budget constraints and budget accountability in the system. I should say, as you probably know, none of these things are far-fetched. The other MDBs in different ways have implemented every single one of these recommendations in their own work. Finally, the fifth recommendation deals with management expertise and management selection. To promote effectiveness and efficiency, we recommend to fill a significantly higher share of management positions through transparent and competitive processes. As Paulo said, the realignment aimed for 100%. Management is now at about 44% of current management positions filled through competitive processes. We're not saying all of them. We do understand there are some positions maybe where you want to have a more directed appointment, but our recommendation would be to enlarge the number that are filled competitively. And to this end, the bank should consider requiring thorough 360-degree evaluations for candidates for management posts. So those were the 5 recommendations. The last recommendation was not fully endorsed at the board and by management. They have the view that they've come a long way and that there are certain, and no question, management is following the procedures that have been approved by the board. There's no question about that. It's the question of what should be the policy and what should be the procedures, and what should be the weight between directed appointment and competitive processes. And our recommendation would be to continue increasing the role of competitive processes. And so we shall see on that. But I will say we had a very good discussion, as I mentioned at the beginning. The board has asked management to go back and develop a more detailed action plan. They did a management response, but to be fair, it was not a lot of time given, and to think about these things is obviously a big challenge. So in the next few months, management has been asked to develop a deeper action plan, certainly taking the first 4 recommendations in mind, maybe not the specific options, but the broad recommendations. And also, I think, considering this 5th one. And I think within 6 months, there will be another discussion at the board on an action plan to move these things forward. So we'll stop there, and we're open for questions on the evaluation. Thank you very much for listening.
New work in projects, we notice that there's an enormous difference in many of them. There's capital letter P projects and small letter projects. But in other words, when we see the statistics, it's just per project, and it's very difficult to differentiate. If you ask a consultant company how much it costs them to build a building, how long it takes them to build a building, I'm sure they'd give you a classification from A to B to C to D. But we keep talking about projects as though they were all the same. And it's really very difficult for statistics like these to distinguish between them and to measure, to see to what extent the project portfolio has changed and how it relates to the cost statistics. That's the first thing. The second is as to the recommendations. I'd like to mention, because I have white hair and we've been here for a while, there are two of these things that have already been done before. The bank had country teams that worked here at headquarters, and in the review section initially, we used to do the technical review and an operational review. The technical review was led by PRA and the operational by OP. And the operations manager had different goals for the same project, and this was something that, in our opinion, worked quite well. Yes, well, I believe that since my team lost yesterday, I was a little shocked, so I might have forgotten a few things. Yeah, we got a real whipping yesterday. But one of the things that we noticed basically was that the cost accounting absence and the absence of incentives to lead to certain discipline as a bank prevents us from actually knowing how much the projects cost. We're always going to be talking of averages, but as we're able to actually have the exact information of the projects, will make it easier for us to define parameters based on countries, based on sectors, and so forth. No, today we do it with a series of parameters which are okay if we compare the general parameters of the IDB with the World Bank. They're more or less the same. But we've noticed also that they don't seem to have the accuracy which we think is necessary. We believe that if we were to really go deeper into the cost accounting and we generate the necessary incentives for the costs to be real, and I'll give you an example. Many of you are team leaders, and you know that you don't actually know how much money you have for an operation. You come to the beginning of the year, and of course it depends on the division head. He's going to say, well, travel with 2 or travel with 5 or don't travel now. But then September comes along and you say, travel, and if you have to buy a washing machine because I have extra money. So obviously, a lot of the people complained about the initial things. Well, they say, okay, I'm here with a portfolio of 80, 90, 100, 120 projects, but I'm free to all the team leaders. So they just insist on my doing everything because there's no price on that, and I'm not free. And in other cases, what happens is that the team leaders come, you're going to travel, and your division head or your manager comes and says, okay, you take 3 more people with you, because it has no implication. So if we don't actually set a budget and make them responsible for defining it and executing and approving the expenses that would go against the activity, it would really be very difficult to have the necessary incentives for the information to be really accurate. That's the first thing. The second thing is regarding what you said. Yes, there were some good practices in the past. We believe that the country teams were a good practice, but in the World Bank they still have them, in fact, and it's still a good idea. The important thing of the country teams was precisely that the country was seen as a complete entity, because what's happening now is that the country manager is seeing the country as a whole, yes, but each one of the divisions is seeing the country only as the number of projects they have. If you have one project in Bolivia, then your country is that project. But if you don't have a project in Bolivia, you don't even see the country. So it's really very difficult to see it comprehensively. Another one of the sub-recommendations that appeared in the document was that we should try to do what was done in the past, was to generate more comprehensive studies that can see the country as a whole and begin to see the actual problems and productivity, growth, poverty, more in a comprehensive manner, to find where the weaknesses are and find shared solutions, intersectorial shared solutions, so that the bank's behavior is led in that way. Any other question? Please, 1, 2, and 3. The one in the back first. 2 and then you 3. Well, thank you very much for sharing your highlights with us. I think I'm going to talk in English.
These efficiency measures compare against the effectiveness side. And I don't know if this is part of the scope of the research or not, but maybe it might also look at the concept that before. I was wondering how some of these indicators that were some of the challenges that are listed, like preparation costs or the preparation times. I agree with the recommendations to cost accounting because we know how much we have on hand to manage these and reduce the basically cut the fat. But how do we know whether or not the muscle? It seems to me more interesting instead of having to count projects or the overall costs or maybe to have some indicators on the quality of the projects themselves or how the projects are being designed or
Bueno, no hemos hecho.
Well, we haven't really done a cost effectiveness analysis. We have, for many reasons, for methodologic as well as for the fact that we didn't have the data, what we have done is to measure some of the efficiency indicators, and we recognize that it's highly limited. Now, the second part of the question was what?
We really kind of appreciate the effort that's being put into the whole development effectiveness framework. And it's one reason, one of the recommendations is to strengthen SPD's capacity, because you really do have to have that countervailing function. It's not just efficiency, it's not just serving the clients, it's also development effectiveness. So you need to have those counterweights and all those things coming in. So I think we really we're quite supportive in here of the DEM and the project design and the emphasis on development effectiveness. You still need a budget constraint. You need to achieve this development effectiveness with a budget constraint. And it's not absolutely hard and fast. If it turns out the budget's wrong at the beginning, you need more. You make the case, then you can get more budget. But I think having that discipline from the beginning, but what you want to deliver is a good project or good implementation with effectiveness. And that comes into the role in the sense of SPD and also the managers, the VPS managers, who will also be very concerned with quality. So it's having checks and balances in the system, but we certainly don't mean to minimize the importance in any way of development effectiveness by emphasizing efficiency as well.
My congratulations, Paolo, for the presentation. It was really very clear. I have a comment very briefly and a question. The comment is in support of what my colleague Sergio said. I worked in the bank beginning of the 90s when there was another realignment or reform or what have you in the bank, and the restructuring at the time was sold, at least to me, precisely as an attempt to break the matrix system that had reached an impasse. They tried to break the dichotomy of the PRA of sectors or operations that were in charge of the countries. So that matrix organization led to a lot of impasse, enormous costs. They broke that, and 3 regions were created precisely to come closer to the country focus idea and even be more effective in the response. Now it would seem that they're doing the same thing with the same intention. I'm retired, yes, but I'm sure that in 10 years there's going to be something similar. But I would like to see the slide on the country focus findings. This one. So what Pablo said was very clear. I'm not going to go back to it, but my question is, in general, the problems of lack of definition between what the manager is doing and the country officer is doing, and how is the interaction, and what's the skill and so forth. This is for the whole bank, of course, but I ask myself, if it depends on the size of the country or the region, is that the same? For example, in Haiti, which is a region of the bank, things would be the same as in Sur or in the Southern Corn, for example. Well, as for the matrix organization, of course, in the document it's explained a little more in detail. But the purpose is that these matrix organizations we also had in the last organization. You had a manager and a head of country division and several sectors, and you had a side organization. There were these matrix organizations, but before, when there was PRA and DOPS, there was a matrix, and now we have a matrix organization. We've always had the matrix organizations, even though we haven't given it that name. When you have two objectives and two business units, let's say, that are competing, you have a matrix organization. The problem is that if you only focus on the structure and you forget the processes, and you forget, or the processes and the human resources and the incentives are not aligned with the matrix organization, then we have a problem. If you're trying to find collaboration and you only have incentives that favor the individual behavior and not the collective, we're going to have problems. So in the last annex that we've included in the evaluation, we have listed each one of these strategy, process, structure, human resource, incentives, and we've seen which were aligned and which were not. If we want to be effective in the development, but what's still important is the performance and disbursement, and we don't find a balance between them, then we're still going to have bosses that when a team leader wants to present a project and qualify it as very high risk, they say, no, don't do it, because they're not going to accept it. Or if you want to delay the disbursement and whoever comes and says, no, approve it, because if you don't do it, then we're not going to reach our goal. Then as long as we don't clearly define those things, any change we do in the structure will be useless. It has to be a change in all 5 design elements of an organization. And as to the size, and I'll keep quiet after that, of course we have to have a one, because we've realized that one size doesn't fit all. And we've seen that clearly, because when we did the case studies, we studied larger countries and compared it to smaller countries, and we realized that in some it might work differently. You cannot have the same organization for El Salvador with a division head, and an operations head and a representative or a country officer, when you have 25 or 30 projects and a whatever portfolio, as you would have in Brazil, where you have 140 some odd and 150 projects, and a country that is almost the size of a continent. So of course we have to define that, and maybe we'd have to define different structures. That's what the realignment proposed, but it's not been done yet.
Basically, can you say more about the 360 evaluations? Whether they are there for internal candidates only?
You know what they are. They're much more thorough reviews of evaluations, in a sense, of staff, by getting feedback from superiors, from peers, and from subordinates in a confidential manner that is put together. And IDB doesn't have anything that's really thorough in that way, and they work very well. And the idea was to have them certainly for all internal candidates. External candidates, you might have to do a different form. You could still do a 360 through references, but you probably could not ask an external candidate to actually go through the whole process. But the idea for internal candidates, there's a lot of companies out there that have tools that are I think very effective ways for really determining managerial capacity of candidates for positions. So that's something we would recommend from experience that has in other organizations. As I say, it's being considered. But I have two questions from country offices. Si la nueva propuesta de
the new decentralization proposal, does it respond to the findings delivered by OVE? The new management proposal. And the second is, how do the recommendations respond to the findings of the administration? And do you have labor experience in the countries? Having labor experience, is that a criteria for the selection of the division heads? Well, we think Actually, we cannot give you an opinion regarding the management proposal because we haven't really evaluated yet. I think it would be unprofessional of me to make a comment on that at this time. Of course, we'd have to see whether it works or not. We know what the proposal is, and we think that the best way to proceed would be to be a little more daring, to increase actually the number of managers in the country so that they have a more limited scope, to have a person that could work in 2 or 3 countries in a more active way when he's in the country. We believe they're not really large structural changes. It wouldn't require a reorganization at all. It would simply be a redefinition of authorities and roles. And we think that if we don't change those incentives, even if you do structural changes, we really are not going to get anything. We'd see the same thing. There's a little progress, but you don't end where you want. And as to the recommendations of the findings that the people are not being treated adequately, no, we haven't made any specific recommendation. We've only made these 5 large recommendations because, of course, there's many findings. So we haven't made one specific recommendation for each finding. What we've done is focus mainly on the largest ones that we thought would have the greatest impact. Without prejudice to the fact that we do believe that we have to work on those as well. There are other studies, of course, that have shown that women compared to men are not being paid the same. Those are things that have to be changed, and that's important. Any other question? Juan Pablo. I don't have a question. I just have a couple of comments. First, I believe that we had the initiative of asking OV to do this. I think that the number of people that heard the presentation, recognized that it was a very good idea, and we want to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. From the Staff Association, we believe that this type of debates of what's happening in the institution is very important, and it strengthens the health of the institution. And I do have some issues regarding what the report does not deal with at all, or very briefly. I think that if we commit to the restructuring of the bank that was before the realignment, when the bank was asking itself what the problems were and so forth, and I think that in the bank, we still have the original problem. The bank collaborates in a resource allocation program and the selection of investments, and it should see how it qualifies for this investment selection. There's one thing where the bank is part and judge, in other words, and we have scarce resources. When there was a crisis before the realignment, the bank had more resources to lend than what was being requested. So actually, the bank was desperate to place the money somewhere. But after the crisis, what begins to happen is that there's an over demand, and so the bank's idea is to increase the resources, once again being in a position where it's not objective enough in the selection of the projects. And I think that it's still a structural problem in the bank. The bank can only honestly participate in the selection of the investments when it handles the resources adequately. So it has to be working based on an over demand and not an under demand of the available resources. That's another structural problem with the bank, is that in the end, where the bank plays its game is in offering case solutions for each case. But this is a bureaucratic solution, and these are good for relatively undifferentiated problems. So this is a problem here which I think is not really being overcome. In fact, the initial success of Speedy, which is to improve the quality of the projects, is also something that could become bureaucratic as well. So we always tend to respond with Speedy correcting the project so they return to the bureaucratic solution, and we really get away from the case itself to see the problem as the original problem that we're trying to overcome. And lastly, It's been said often that the bank has bet on this, and it's very clear in the report, on professionalizing its technical cadre to make them more professional. However, I'm under the impression that the bank is mistaken in the type of knowledge required and what's really essential for the bank. Many years ago, when someone gave me one of those sentences that you never forget, is that the problem of Latin America is that it has wonderful policymakers and terrible public administration. So what we have to do is to get those wonderful ideas to be possible and make them viable. The art of making things viable is a manager's job. Their operational problems, they have to do with the viability of the project and not the advisability of it. And those are the issues that I still think are on the wrong side of the table. Yes, they have improved on some things. They have added some management tools and not the strictly sector tools. Now we have some efforts to improve the operations, let's say, and establish timetables. And I'll end with this. When I began in the bank, we had to argue why we had to postpone the date of the last disbursement. And I was always worried because I'd say, why do I have to justify the postponement of the date when no one had to convince them why the original date was set? Why is it 4 or 5 years? If we were whimful at the beginning, why can't we be whimful at the end as well? And I'll end with that.
Muy rápidamente, o sea, tu primer comentario.
Very quickly, your first comment regarding the relevance of the realignment. Well, how much it's helped the bank to have greater presence and relevance in the region. In the focus document, we said that we didn't think it was going to be possible, that we were only going to evaluate the extent to which the bank had achieved its objectives, greater sector and country focus, efficiency as defined by the documents, and not as we define efficiency or country focus, but as they had defined in the document. And that we were not going to evaluate, as I said, the impact of the realignment on the relevance and presence of the bank or its effect on development. So in that respect, that's it. As to the second, yes, it's true. We mentioned it in the document. Speedy has had an overly important role in improving the project designs, but we've also noticed that it's led to what seems to be a goals displacement. Something that we see, let's say, as a tool, which is AIDEN, becomes the objective in itself. So there's a problem in that. And we're seeing this. All projects now have excellent AIDENs, which means that they're all wonderful projects. Well, we'll have to see after a few years. You'll have to speculate and see what you think. There's obviously a problem there. The team leaders said they were important. Now we come with the projects. We spend 3, 4, 5 months worrying on how to write this here, the indicator, the goal, but it really has nothing to do with the project itself, is what they say. Well, those are the frustrations that many people said, reflecting what you're saying as to the location of some of the processes. And as to the knowledge, yes, it's also true, and we mentioned it. When we tried to see how the staff profile in the bank had changed, what we first found was that there was no real definition of what the profile of the bank officer or staff should be. So we tried to see what criteria were being used, and we really didn't find any systematic criteria. To make a before and after comparison, we had to design 5 or 6 categories, I think, dialogue, technical dialogue, political dialogue, execution skills. And anyways, we defined a series of criteria and how to measure them, because that was not captured or automated in the bank's procedures. Of course, it's not logical, but we trust that the Human Resource Department does have them and is working with them. I think one final question.
Why do you presuppose that a country manager can be more active in his or her countries if she is based in the field rather than Washington, D.C.? I can give a first cut at that. I think the idea is, first of all, back to the objectives of the realignment, which were to build country offices as the primary place for strategy setting and program implementation. But also, I think from experience, and again, you can look at a number of other MDBs, whether it's CAF or IFC or World Bank or now the African Development Bank, they're all moving to put more authority into the country offices. I think a lot of the feedback that Pablo and the team got was, these other, whether it's CAF or World Bank, you ask for something, they give you an answer. IDB, you ask for something, they say, wait, I have to check with headquarters. It can be a real problem. And I guess one question is why? Why are we so focused in Washington? This is a region that's very developed and with very good skills. And certainly most of our partners are taking advantage of this and really delegating authority much more to be with the client on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just one person, it's the idea of a country team where really the balance of activity and decision-making authority is shifted. It does lead to a significant shift in the way an organization functions. And I think it would be our recommendation. And not only ours, of course, this was the original goal of the Real Time. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Solamente un dato
Just one thing.
que hemos
Just one thing. In the feedback we've gotten, people said that the bureaucracy generated at the headquarters goes from 50 to 80% of the daily work of each person. Obviously, this is a very raw measurement, unreliable. Perhaps if you ask them in the morning, they may say 50, 80. Later in the day, maybe say 55, 65. But it does express the concern of an elephantiasis here at the headquarters, concentration of power. The headquarters prevents people from doing their work on the one hand, and on the other hand, according to 100% of the country reps, they said they would prefer to have the decision-making authority at the country level.